The autumn wind whistled through the nearly empty parking lot of Cedar Grove High School as a middle-aged man stood before the building, his weathered hands clutching a worn photograph. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion and grief, fixed upon the school's brick facade where just 2 years ago, his son had walked these very grounds. Mr. Chen wasn't always the quiet, reserved man people now saw. There was a time when his infectious laugh would fill any room he entered, when his restaurant was the heart of their small community. But that was before the incident, before a group of wealthy teenagers decided his son's life was worth less than their evening's entertainment. It had started as a typical Friday night. His son, a bright sophomore with dreams of becoming an environmental scientist, was walking home from the local library. He always took the long route through the park, photographing interesting plants for his research project. That's when the group of senior students, driving their expensive cars and high on their own privileged existence, spotted him. The security cameras captured everything. The way they swerved their cars, pretending to almost hit him for fun. The way they laughed and recorded videos on their phones. And then, the moment when fun turned to tragedy. His son, startled by their game, stepped backward into the path of an oncoming car. The aftermath was a blur of hospital corridors, beeping machines, and finally, devastating silence. But what truly broke Mr. Chen wasn't just the loss, it was what came after. The videos of the incident went viral on social media, with comments mocking his son's reaction. The wealthy parents hired expensive lawyers who painted it as a simple accident. The school board, heavily influenced by donations from these same families, swept the incident under the rug. They all laughed. At the funeral, he overheard them in whispered conversations, calling it just a prank gone wrong and not really their fault. At the school board meeting, they chuckled behind their hands as he pleaded for justice. Even at his restaurant, they would come in, pointing and snickering, knowing their money and influence protected them from consequences. But Mr. Chen was no longer the same man who had immigrated to this country with nothing but hope and determination. The grief had transformed him, hardened him. He spent months meticulously gathering information, learning about each person involved in his son's death and the subsequent cover-up. Not for violence, no, he had something far more effective in mind. He started with the school board president, Mr. Thompson. The man who had dismissed his concerns with a condescending smile. Mr. Chen discovered that Thompson's prestigious position relied heavily on maintaining certain appearances. So he began leaving small offerings at Thompson's doorstep each morning, printouts of emails showing questionable financial decisions, photos of meetings with known corrupt officials, all perfectly legal evidence but devastating if made public. Each morning, as Thompson found these reminders of his past actions, his smug smile began to fade. The man who once laughed at a father's grief now jumped at shadows, wondering what other secrets might surface next. Mr. Chen watched from afar as Thompson's confident stride became a nervous shuffle. The local news began picking up stories of mysterious whistleblowers exposing corruption in the school system. Anonymous tips led investigators to discover irregularities in construction contracts, suspicious college recommendation letters, and altered student records. The wealthy families who had once laughed behind their hands now found themselves facing public scrutiny. Mr. Chen's restaurant became busy again, but not with the sneering teenagers and their enabling parents. Instead, it filled with journalists seeking background on the growing scandal, with parents of other bullied students who finally felt brave enough to speak up, with community members who had long suspected something was wrong but never had proof. As autumn turned to winter, Mr. Chen continued his patient work. Each morning, he would visit his son's grave, updating him on the changes happening in their town. "They're not laughing anymore," he would whisper, placing fresh flowers by the headstone. "They're learning what it feels like to lose something precious, their reputation, their influence, their sense of invulnerability." The father who once stood alone at a school board meeting, mocked and dismissed, was now at the center of a growing movement for accountability in their community. His quiet determination had sparked something larger than himself, a reckoning long overdue in a town where money had always bought silence. And this was just the beginning. Mr. Chen had 6 more targets on his list, each one representing a person who had laughed at his darkest moment. He wasn't seeking revenge through violence or illegal acts, his plan was far more sophisticated. He would use truth as his weapon, exposure as his tool, and justice as his ultimate goal. As he walked back to his car that evening, the same autumn wind now carried whispers of change through the town. The laughter had stopped, replaced by nervous glances and hushed conversations. Mr. Chen allowed himself a small smile, not of joy, but of grim satisfaction. The first phase of his plan was complete, and the remaining parts would unfold just as methodically, just as inevitably, as the changing of the seasons. The winter frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of Cedar Grove's most prestigious country club as Mr. Chen sat in his parked car, watching the Sunday brunch crowd arrive. Among them was his next target, Mrs. Reed, the school district's legal counsel who had worked tirelessly to protect the wealthy students involved in his son's death. He remembered her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the conference room table as she dismissed his lawyer's evidence, her lipsticked smile as she suggested his son's poor choices had led to the tragedy. Now, those same perfectly manicured hands were about to drop her crystal champagne flute. Over the past 3 months, Mr. Chen had built a reputation as the town's premier caterer for high society events. His new specialty? Private parties for the elite, where his carefully crafted appetizers and attentive service gave him access to conversations never meant for outsider ears. The wealthy had a habit of speaking freely around those they considered beneath them. Tonight was Mrs. Reed's annual charity gala, an event she used to cement her position in local society. Mr. Chen had made sure his catering service was the only one available after the usual vendors mysteriously received better offers elsewhere. His staff, carefully selected from others who had suffered under the town's corrupt system, were experts at being invisible while keeping their ears open. As he prepared the event's signature dishes, Mr. Chen thought about the USB drive hidden in his pocket. It contained recordings from his restaurant's security system, conversations between Mrs. Reed and various clients discussing how to bury evidence in multiple cases, not just his son's. She had a pattern of helping wealthy clients escape consequences, all while maintaining her reputation as a pillar of the community. The gala began like any other high society event. Women in designer dresses air-kissed each other's cheeks while men in expensive suits discussed golf scores and stock portfolios. Mrs. Reed floated through the crowd in her element, never noticing how Mr. Chen's staff were systematically placing sealed envelopes under every dinner plate. At precisely 8:45 p.m., as Mrs. Reed stood to make her annual speech about justice and community service, the envelopes were discovered. Inside each was a detailed account of her legal manipulations, complete with dates, times, and transcript excerpts. The evidence was damning but entirely legal, the truth presented in its starkest form. The reaction was immediate but subtle, in the way of the wealthy. Phones emerged from purses and pockets. Whispered conversations replaced polite laughter. By the time Mrs. Reed finished her speech about integrity in the legal system, half her audience was avoiding eye contact. Mr. Chen watched from the kitchen as her confident smile faltered. She had spent decades building her reputation, crafting an image of respectability that had allowed her to profit from others' misfortunes. Now, in a single evening, that carefully constructed facade was cracking. The next morning, local news websites ran stories about potential ethics violations in the school district's legal department. Anonymous sources suggested a pattern of preferential treatment. Mrs. Reed's previous clients began distancing themselves, afraid their own secrets might be next to emerge. But Mr. Chen wasn't finished. Over the next week, more evidence appeared, in the inboxes of legal ethics boards, on the desks of investigative journalists, in the hands of families who had previously lost cases against Mrs. Reed's wealthy clients. Each piece of evidence was legitimate, obtained through careful observation and legal means. Mrs. Reed's downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. Instead, it was death by 1,000 cuts to her reputation. The invitations to social events slowed, then stopped. Her phone calls went unreturned. The same people who had laughed with her at Mr. Chen's grief now crossed the street to avoid her. 2 weeks after the gala, Mrs. Reed resigned from her position, citing personal reasons. The local bar association announced an investigation into her past cases. The wealthy families who had once depended on her services now pretended they barely knew her name. Mr. Chen took no pleasure in her fall from grace. This wasn't about enjoyment, it was about justice, about showing that actions had consequences, even for those who thought themselves above the law. As he stood in his restaurant kitchen, preparing the next day's specialties, he updated the list in his mind. 2 down, 5 to go. The photo of his son smiled down at him from its place of honor near the register. Justice comes in many forms, he whispered to the image. Sometimes the quietest revenge is the most effective. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow through Cedar Grove, carrying with it whispers of more changes to come. The comfortable world of the town's elite was showing cracks, and through those cracks, long-buried truths were beginning to emerge. Mr. Chen's patient, methodical plan was working exactly as intended, and his next target was already in sight. Spring arrived early in Cedar Grove, bringing with it the sweet scent of cherry blossoms and the bitter taste of karma. Mr. Chen stood in the parking lot of the local television station, watching as Dr. Wilson, the third name on his list, hurried inside for his regular morning segment on the local news. As the town's most prominent child psychologist, Dr. Wilson had played a crucial role in dismissing the psychological impact of bullying at Cedar Grove High. After Mr. Chen's son's death, he had written a controversial report claiming that modern teenagers were too sensitive and that traditional bullying was just part of growing up. He had laughed during his TV interviews, calling grieving parents overprotective and enabling. But Mr. Chen had spent months preparing for this moment. Working with a network of parents whose children had been bullied, he had collected hundreds of hours of recordings from therapy sessions where Dr. Wilson had dismissed serious concerns. More importantly, he had discovered that the doctor's prestigious research papers, the foundation of his reputation, contained some interesting inconsistencies. The morning show began as usual, with Dr. Wilson sharing his expert advice about teenage resilience. But today was different. As he spoke, the station's producers were receiving dozens of emails from former patients, each sharing their stories of how his dismissive attitude had worsened their trauma. Among these emails was a detailed analysis of his research methodology, revealing alarming patterns of data manipulation. Mr. Chen watched from the station's cafe, sipping his green tea, as chaos erupted in the studio. The production assistant's hands shook as she handed papers to the news anchor. The segment cut to commercial break early, but the damage was already done. Social media was buzzing with clips from the broadcast, alongside countless stories from former patients. Dr. Wilson's carefully crafted image as a caring professional crumbled in real time. His speaking engagements were cancelled one by one. The universities that had proudly hosted his seminars now launched investigations into his research. The same parents who had once quoted his expertise now demanded refunds for their sessions. But the true masterstroke came from an unexpected direction. Mr. Chen had anonymously shared Dr. Wilson's writings with a respected psychology journal, which published a scathing analysis of his methods. The doctor's peers, many of whom had privately disagreed with his dismissive approach to bullying, now had academic ammunition to publicly challenge his views. The impact rippled through the community. Other mental health professionals began speaking out about the importance of taking bullying seriously. Schools that had relied on Dr. Wilson's minimizing approach to bullying were forced to reevaluate their policies. Parents who had been silenced by his authority now found their voices. Mr. Chen's restaurant became an unofficial meeting place for families sharing their experiences. He would listen quietly as they talked about their children's struggles, about how Dr. Wilson had made them doubt their own parenting instincts. Each story reinforced the righteousness of his cause. One evening, as he was closing up, Dr. Wilson himself came to the restaurant. The once confident psychiatrist looked deflated, his designer suit replaced by casual wear, his trademark smile nowhere to be seen. He didn't recognize Mr. Chen as he ordered a simple bowl of noodles. "Your career was built on dismissing others' pain," Mr. Chen thought as he prepared the meal. "Now you understand what it feels like to be dismissed yourself." He served the noodles with his usual professional courtesy, watching as the doctor ate alone in the corner. As spring flowers continued to bloom across Cedar Grove, Dr. Wilson's practice withered. His office, once bustling with wealthy clients, stood empty. The television station replaced his segments with a younger psychiatrist who specialized in bullying prevention. His research papers were marked with warnings about potentially manipulated data. Mr. Chen visited his son's grave, now surrounded by fresh spring growth. "Three down," he whispered, placing a small bunch of cherry blossoms beside the headstone. "Your story is changing things. People are finally listening." The local school board, still reeling from the previous scandals, announced a complete overhaul of their bullying policies. Students who had suffered in silence began speaking up. Parents who had once laughed along with Dr. Wilson's dismissive attitudes now attended workshops on recognizing and preventing bullying. As Mr. Chen drove home that evening, he reflected on how his revenge was transforming the community. It wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged his son, it was about changing the system that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Each person he exposed created ripples that affected others, slowly shifting the town's culture of privilege and impunity. At home, he updated his journal, a detailed record of his methodical campaign for justice. Four names remained on his list, each representing someone who had laughed at his grief. But now, with each success, these remaining targets were growing nervous. They had watched their colleagues fall, not through violence or illegal acts, but through the simple exposure of truth. The spring wind carried the scent of cherry blossoms through his open window as he prepared for the next phase of his plan. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of children playing in the park, the same park where his son had died. But now, when he heard laughter, it no longer filled him with pain. Instead, it reminded him of why his mission was so important. "The truth," he whispered to his son's photo, "is the most powerful weapon we have." And he had plenty more truth to share. Summer arrived in Cedar Grove with an unprecedented heat wave, but it wasn't just the temperature making people sweat. Mr. Chen's fourth target, Police Chief Rogers, was feeling the pressure mounting with each passing day. Chief Rogers had been the one who initially classified the incident with Mr. Chen's son as a simple accident. He was the one who had chuckled and said, "Kids will be kids," when shown the videos of the wealthy teenagers harassing the boy. His casual dismissal had set the tone for the entire investigation. But Mr. Chen had spent the past month volunteering at community events, quietly building relationships with retired officers and administrative staff. Each person had a story about the chief's selective enforcement of the law, how certain families' children never seemed to face consequences, while others were prosecuted to the fullest extent. The chief's downfall began with something small, a series of public records requests. Mr. Chen had learned that in a small town like Cedar Grove, patterns emerged when you knew where to look. Traffic violations dismissed without explanation. Complaints mysteriously vanishing from the system. Property damage incidents marked resolved without investigation. Through his restaurant, Mr. Chen had become friends with a local data analyst who specialized in pattern recognition. Together, they created visualizations showing how enforcement patterns aligned perfectly with the town's wealth distribution. It wasn't just about his son anymore, it was about years of systemic favoritism. The evidence was damning but entirely legal. Crime statistics. Public records. Witness statements. Mr. Chen compiled it all into a comprehensive report, which he submitted simultaneously to the State Police Oversight Committee, local news outlets, and the town council. Chief Rogers first noticed something was wrong when reporters started asking uncomfortable questions at his weekly press briefing. Why did certain neighborhoods see higher patrol frequencies? How did he explain the statistical anomalies in prosecution rates? The chief's usual confident smile began to fade. But Mr. Chen's masterstroke came from an unexpected source. His regular customers at the restaurant included several police officers from neighboring towns. Over plates of perfectly prepared food, they shared their own frustrations with Cedar Grove's selective enforcement. Some had lost faith in the profession after witnessing the chief's behavior. One evening, as Mr. Chen served dinner to a retired state investigator, he overheard a crucial piece of information. The chief had been maintaining 2 sets of records, one for public view and one for special cases. The revelation wasn't surprising, but the confirmation was all Mr. Chen needed. Anonymous tips began flowing to the State Oversight Committee. Officers from neighboring jurisdictions submitted formal complaints about cases that had been improperly dismissed. The chief's carefully maintained system of favors and overlooked infractions began unraveling thread by thread. The town council called an emergency meeting. Mr. Chen attended, sitting quietly in the back as he had done so many times before. But this time, instead of dismissive laughter, he watched the chief struggle to explain years of inconsistent enforcement. The statistical evidence was projected on the wall behind him, each graph and chart telling its own story of institutional bias. Chief Rogers attempted to maintain his authority, arguing that his methods had kept the peace in Cedar Grove. But his voice lacked its usual conviction. The same council members who had once supported him now distanced themselves, afraid of being caught in the growing scandal. The state police announced an official investigation. News vans parked outside the police station. Former officers came forward with more stories. The chief's reputation, built over 20 years of selective enforcement, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Mr. Chen watched it all from the quiet comfort of his restaurant. He served coffee to the reporters covering the story, nodded politely to the state investigators conducting interviews, and listened as his customers discussed the latest developments. The wheels of justice, once stalled, were finally turning. Chief Rogers resigned before the investigation could conclude, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. His departure sparked a broader examination of the entire department's practices. New policies were implemented. Training programs were overhauled. The culture of selective enforcement began to shift. Late one night, as Mr. Chen cleaned his kitchen, he found himself thinking about his son. "You always believed in doing what was right," he whispered to the ever-present photograph. Even when it wasn't easy. 4 people had now faced the consequences of their actions, not through violence or illegal means, but through the simple power of exposed truth. The summer heat continued to bear down on Cedar Grove, but something else was changing in the town. People began to feel safer reporting incidents, knowing they would be taken seriously regardless of who was involved. The wealthy families who had once enjoyed immunity found themselves being held to the same standards as everyone else. Mr. Chen updated his list, crossing off the chief's name. 3 targets remained, 3 more people who had laughed at his darkest moment. But now they weren't laughing anymore. Instead, they were watching nervously, wondering when their own misdeeds would come to light. As he drove home that evening, Mr. Chen passed the police station. A new interim chief was being sworn in, promising transparency and equal enforcement of the law. Change was coming to Cedar Grove, one exposed truth at a time. The photograph of his son seemed to smile a little brighter that night. Justice doesn't always wear a badge, Mr. Chen thought as he prepared for bed. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in truth and served with patience. And he had plenty of both left for the remaining names on his list. The late summer rain drummed steadily against the windows of Cedar Grove's most exclusive private school as Mr. Chen sat in his parked car, watching Principal Baker hurry into the building. The start of the new school year was approaching, and with it came Mr. Chen's opportunity to confront his fifth target. Principal Baker had been more than just a passive observer in the tragedy of Mr. Chen's son. She had been the one who dismissed multiple reports of bullying before the incident, who had smiled condescendingly during parent meetings, who had laughed softly and told grieving parents that they were overreacting to typical teenage behavior. But Mr. Chen had spent the summer preparing. His restaurant had catered several school board meetings, where he'd overheard conversations about the school's questionable financial practices. He'd befriended the janitorial staff, who shared stories about destroyed evidence of bullying incidents. Most importantly, he'd connected with former teachers who had quit rather than participate in the system of willful ignorance. The truth began emerging through an unexpected channel, the school's alumni newsletter. Mr. Chen had worked with a former school newspaper editor to create a special edition focused on reflecting on our past to build a better future. The edition featured interviews with former students who had transferred out due to bullying, teachers who had been silenced, and parents who had withdrawn their children. Principal Baker's first indication that something was wrong came when major donors started calling. The stories in the newsletter weren't just about bullying, they revealed a pattern of mishandled funds, falsified academic records, and covered-up incidents. Each account was carefully documented, supported by records and witnesses willing to come forward. The principal's usual morning announcements were interrupted by the arrival of Education Board investigators. Anonymous tips had led them to examine the school's financial records more closely. Mr. Chen watched from his car as suited officials carried boxes of documents from the building. But the real pressure came from an unexpected source, the students themselves. Inspired by the alumni newsletter, current students began sharing their own experiences on social media. The carefully maintained image of Cedar Grove's most prestigious school began to crack as stories of ignored complaints and institutional bias went viral. Principal Baker attempted to maintain control, calling an emergency assembly to address the misunderstandings. But as she stood at the podium, her usual authoritative presence was diminished by the empty seats of students whose parents had kept them home in protest. Mr. Chen had arranged for copies of all bullying reports filed during Baker's tenure to be delivered to every school board member. The sheer volume of ignored complaints was staggering. More disturbing were the patterns that emerged, how reports involving wealthy students were consistently dismissed, while similar incidents involving less privileged students led to severe punishments. The school's reputation, built over decades, unraveled in weeks. Parents who had once bragged about their children attending Cedar Grove's elite private school now scrambled to transfer them elsewhere. Teachers who had been silenced found their voices, sharing stories of how Principal Baker had pressured them to modify grades and ignore behavioral issues for certain students. One rainy afternoon, as Mr. Chen served lunch in his restaurant, he overheard a conversation between two school board members. They were discussing the upcoming emergency meeting to address the mounting crisis. Principal Baker's position, once seemingly unassailable, was now precarious. The meeting was held on a stormy evening. Mr. Chen attended, sitting quietly in his usual spot at the back of the room. He watched as Principal Baker, her designer suit no longer quite so crisp, attempted to defend her actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. Years of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, and ignored complaints had finally caught up with her. The board voted unanimously to place her on administrative leave pending a full investigation. As she left the meeting, her high heels clicking against the floor, she no longer carried herself with the same arrogant confidence that had once characterized her dismissal of concerned parents. The aftermath brought significant changes to the school. A temporary administrator was appointed, one with a strong background in anti-bullying initiatives. The new leadership began implementing comprehensive reforms, including anonymous reporting systems and mandatory training for all staff. Mr. Chen visited his son's grave the next day, the summer rain creating gentle patterns on the polished stone. "5 down," he whispered, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. The school will be different now. Other children will be safer. The changes rippled through Cedar Grove's educational system. Other schools, seeing what had happened at the prestigious private institution, began reviewing their own policies. Parents became more vocal about their concerns, knowing they would finally be heard. That evening, as Mr. Chen prepared for the dinner rush at his restaurant, he noticed Principal Baker sitting alone at a corner table. She looked smaller somehow, her carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. She didn't order anything, just sat there staring at her reflection in the window, perhaps seeing herself clearly for the first time. Mr. Chen felt no joy in her downfall, only a sense of justice served. Each person who had laughed at his grief was learning an important lesson about accountability. Not through violence or illegal acts, but through the simple power of exposed truth. The summer rain continued to fall outside as he updated his list. 2 names remained, 2 more people who had treated his son's death as a joke. But now they weren't laughing. Instead, they were watching nervously, wondering when their own misdeeds would come to light. Truth, he thought as he closed his restaurant that night, is patient. It waits in the shadows until the right moment to step into the light. And he had more truths to reveal, more justice to serve, before his mission would be complete. The early autumn chill settled over Cedar Grove as Mr. Chen prepared for his 6th target, Mr. Patterson, the wealthy business owner whose son had been driving the car that swerved toward Mr. Chen's boy that fateful night. Patterson had not only laughed at the funeral but had also used his influence to protect his son from any consequences. Mr. Chen had spent months quietly investing in local businesses that competed with Patterson's companies. Not to harm them, but to help them thrive. He provided affordable catering to their corporate events, offered his restaurant as a meeting space for their clients, and connected them with the growing network of people who had been wronged by Cedar Grove's elite. Patterson's first hint that something was wrong came when his largest clients began quietly taking their business elsewhere. There were no dramatic confrontations, just a steady stream of polite emails about exploring other options. The businesses Mr. Chen had supported offered better services, fairer prices, and most importantly, ethical practices. Through his connections in the restaurant industry, Mr. Chen had learned about Patterson's habit of underpaying immigrant workers and violating labor laws. He ensured this information reached labor rights organizations and investigative journalists. Again, everything was legal, just careful documentation of long-ignored violations. The turning point came during a charity gala where Patterson was supposed to receive a Business Leader of the Year award. Mr. Chen had catered the event, ensuring each table setting included a QR code linking to a website documenting Patterson's business practices. As the businessmen stood to accept his award, phones throughout the room lit up with notifications. The charity organization quickly distanced itself from Patterson. Other business leaders, afraid of being associated with the growing scandal, began declining meetings. The same social circles that had once protected him now treated him like a liability. But Mr. Chen's most effective move came through supporting Patterson's own employees. He offered his restaurant as a safe space for workers to meet with labor organizers, provided evidence of violations to regulatory agencies, and helped connect whistleblowers with legal representation. Patterson's carefully built business empire began showing cracks. Investigations into labor violations led to heavy fines. Clients continued migrating to more ethical competitors. The man who had once laughed at a grieving father's pain now found himself struggling to maintain his position in the community he had once dominated. One evening, as Mr. Chen closed his restaurant, he spotted Patterson sitting in his expensive car across the street. The businessman looked older now, his arrogant smile replaced by a worried frown. He didn't get out of the car, just sat there watching, perhaps finally understanding the true cost of his actions. Mr. Chen visited his son's grave, now surrounded by autumn leaves. "Six down," he whispered, arranging fresh flowers. "Your story is changing the way this town treats power and privilege." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of more change to come. The impact spread beyond Patterson's immediate businesses. Other companies in Cedar Grove began reviewing their labor practices, afraid of facing similar exposure. Workers felt more empowered to speak up about violations. The town's business culture was slowly shifting toward greater accountability. That night, as Mr. Chen updated his journal, he realized his campaign for justice had evolved into something larger than personal revenge. Each exposed truth created ripples that affected the entire community, challenging long-established systems of privilege and impunity. Only one name remained on his list, the final person who had laughed at his darkest moment. But now, that last target was watching nervously, aware that their turn was coming. In Cedar Grove, laughter at others' pain had become a dangerous thing, not through violence or illegal acts, but through the simple power of exposed truth. Justice, Mr. Chen thought as he prepared for his final target, is like cooking. It requires patience, precision, and the right ingredients. And he had saved his most powerful truth for last. The late autumn winds swept through Cedar Grove streets as Mr. Chen stood before the town's most prestigious law firm. Inside was his final target, District Attorney Collins, the man who had not only refused to prosecute the case but had actually laughed during the Grieving Father's plea for justice, dismissing it as teenage hijinks gone wrong. After 6 successful exposures, Mr. Chen had gained a reputation in Cedar Grove. Not as a vengeful man, but as someone who had an uncanny ability to uncover long-buried truths. People now came to his restaurant not just for the food, but to share their stories, their evidence, their long-suppressed grievances. And they had plenty to say about D.A. Collins. The pattern was clear: cases involving wealthy families mysteriously disappeared, while minor offenses from less privileged citizens were prosecuted to the fullest extent. But Mr. Chen had something more damaging than just statistics. For months, he had been building relationships with courthouse staff, legal clerks, and former prosecutors who had left Collins's office in disgust. Each person had a piece of the puzzle: emails, recordings, documentation of cases that had been buried or charges that had been inflated based on social status. The DA's downfall began during a routine press conference about crime statistics. As Collins stood at the podium boasting about his office's conviction rates, journalists received anonymous emails containing a very different set of numbers. The data showed a clear correlation between case dismissals and political donations, between prosecution rates and social connections. But Mr. Chen's masterpiece was yet to come. He had discovered that Collins had a habit of recording his conversations, believing these recordings protected him. Instead, they had become a record of his bias, countless moments of him laughing about grieving families, dismissing victims' concerns, and openly discussing how to protect the town's elite from consequences. The recordings began appearing one by one, released through legal channels to oversight committees and investigative journalists. Each revelation sparked new investigations, new questions, new demands for accountability. The DA's confident smile began to fade as his own words came back to haunt him. One evening, as Mr. Chen served dinner at his restaurant, he overheard courthouse employees discussing Collins's increasingly erratic behavior. The DA had begun checking his office for bugs, questioning his staff's loyalty, jumping at shadows. The man who had once laughed at others' pain was now consumed by paranoia. The State Bar Association announced an investigation into Collins's conduct. Former cases were reopened for review. Families who had been denied justice began coming forward, their stories finally being heard. The DA's carefully constructed world of privilege and protection was crumbling. Mr. Chen visited his son's grave, now covered in autumn leaves. "The last one," he whispered, placing fresh flowers. "The man who laughed at our pain is learning what it feels like to lose everything he valued." The wind seemed to whisper back, carrying the essence of justice long delayed but finally arriving. Collins made one final attempt to save himself, calling a press conference to denounce what he called a conspiracy against him. But as he spoke, more evidence emerged. His own recordings played on local news stations, his laughter at victims' pain now exposed for all to hear. The next morning, Collins submitted his resignation. The man who had once wielded the power of justice as a weapon to protect the privileged now faced disbarment proceedings and multiple investigations. His legacy would not be one of legal triumph, but of exposed corruption. That evening, as Mr. Chen closed his restaurant, he looked at his completed list. 7 names, 7 people who had laughed at his darkest moment, 7 powerful figures who had thought themselves above justice. Each had fallen not through violence or illegal acts, but through the simple power of exposed truth. Cedar Grove was changing. The systems that had protected the privileged were being dismantled. People who had once stayed silent out of fear now spoke up, knowing their voices would be heard. The town's culture of impunity was being replaced by one of accountability. Justice, Mr. Chen thought as he drove home under the autumn stars, is like the changing of seasons. It may seem slow, but it is inevitable when truth is on your side. His mission was complete, but its effects would continue to ripple through the community for years to come. Winter returned to Cedar Grove, bringing with it the anniversary of Mr. Chen's son's death. The town had changed dramatically in the year since he had begun his quest for justice. The 7 people who had laughed at his grief had all faced the consequences of their actions, not through violence, but through the unstoppable power of truth. The morning was crisp and clear as Mr. Chen walked through the park where his son had died. The place no longer filled him with unbearable pain. Instead, he noticed the new safety measures installed, the security cameras that actually worked, the emergency call boxes placed at regular intervals. Changes brought about by his campaign for justice. His restaurant had become more than just a business, it had transformed into a community center where people felt safe sharing their stories. The walls, once bare, now displayed photographs of community events, newspaper clippings about positive changes in Cedar Grove, and most prominently, a beautiful portrait of his son. That morning, as he prepared to open, a group of students from Cedar Grove High School arrived. They were part of a new anti-bullying initiative, one of many reforms implemented after the exposure of systemic corruption. They asked if they could hold their meetings in his restaurant, seeing it as a symbol of positive change. Mr. Chen thought about how different things were now. School board president Thompson had been replaced by someone who actually listened to parents' concerns. Mrs. Reed, the former legal counsel, had been disbarred, her cases under review. Dr. Wilson's dismissive theories about bullying had been thoroughly discredited. Police Chief Rogers's departure had led to genuine reforms in law enforcement. Principal Baker's removal had transformed the private school's culture. Patterson's business empire had crumbled, replaced by companies that treated workers fairly. And D.A. Collins faced criminal charges for his years of selective justice. But more important than these individual falls from grace was how the town itself had changed. The wealthy no longer assumed they could laugh at others' pain without consequences. The systems that had protected privilege were being dismantled. People who had once stayed silent now spoke up, knowing they would be heard. As Mr. Chen served breakfast to the students, he overheard them discussing their projects, peer support programs, anonymous reporting systems, community outreach initiatives. His son's story had become a catalyst for change, inspiring a new generation to stand up against bullying and injustice. Later that day, he visited his son's grave. The headstone was no longer a symbol of powerless grief, but a monument to transformative justice. "We did it," he whispered, arranging fresh winter flowers. "Your story changed everything. They're not laughing anymore." He placed his completed list beside the flowers. 7 names, 7 people who had thought themselves above justice, 7 powerful figures who had laughed at a father's pain. Each had fallen through the simple exposure of truth, their own actions becoming their undoing. As he stood there, he noticed other people visiting nearby graves. Parents whose children had been bullied now found support and understanding. Students who had once felt powerless now had channels to report abuse. The culture of silence had been broken. That evening, as snowflakes began to fall, Mr. Chen hosted a community dinner at his restaurant. People from all walks of life gathered: students, teachers, workers, parents, even some of the reformed wealthy families who had learned hard lessons about accountability. Looking around at the diverse crowd, Mr. Chen realized his quest for revenge had evolved into something far more meaningful. It wasn't just about punishing those who had laughed at his grief. It was about transforming a community, about replacing a culture of privilege and impunity with one of justice and accountability. As he served food to his guests, he thought about how revenge, like good cooking, was all about transformation. He had taken the raw ingredients of truth and justice, applied the heat of exposure, and created something that nourished the entire community. The winter wind whistled outside, but inside his restaurant was warm with conversation and hope. Cedar Grove would never be perfect, but it had changed fundamentally. The laughter of the privileged at others' pain had been replaced by the sound of honest dialogue and genuine community. Mr. Chen's mission was complete, but its effects would continue rippling through the town for generations to come. His son's story had become a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, was inevitable when truth was on your side. And in Cedar Grove, truth had finally won.